Good evening, Dr. Michael Fisher. I want to go into a talk today. It's kind of a lecture, really, and it's on postmodernism or postmodernity or postmodern. Um, and the undercurrent or underbelly of that is something called post-structuralism. I'm going to flash those in front of you. So they sound sort of big in technical terms, perhaps to some not. This is a real intro, but it's also just kind of my Fisher view of what I've come to understand. And I'll start with the story of going to university the first time. I'd been reading, I was 46 when I started my PhD, so it took me a while to accustomize myself to the academic environment of the time. So this would be in the years 1998 to 2003. And I was, read bits of postmodern ideas, criticisms of postmodern ideas, a little bit here and there from a philosopher named Ken Wilber. But when I got into university, I got full bore, full blast, you know, fire hose full of postmodern theory, post-structuralism, and because it was all part of the courses I had to take to get prepared for writing and doing a dissertation in this time of the current 21st century. And I was overwhelmed, to say the least, encountering those terms, and it become a much bigger and broader picture, very complex. I remember one of the articles was a huge, thick article we had to read on what is postmodern. And when I was started reading it, the author started, and I'm glad they did, is people think they know what postmodern is, a lot of people, but they probably don't. And or they don't know very accurately. They only know partially, and at worst, they distort what postmodern actually is about. And then they say there is no one definition of what postmodern is about. And by that time, in the opening page of this huge, thick article, I realized I'm going into a world of a lot of things I don't know about and a lot of things that are complicated. So I'm going to just give the definition of postmodernity. It is complicated and it's complex. And of course, it represents something. So when I show that on the first part, postmodern, that's a historical term or a category. So that's how I'm going to start this talk. Let's get a sense of the history of ideas in a way, history of values, ideas, ways of being that a historian could organize around ancient and archaic, the earliest, prehistory, even sometimes called, to pre modern times. This would be like early medieval and before. Then there's modern times. In modern times, generally are accepted, at least in a lot of theories about postmodern and modern history, is modern starts with the Enlightenment, Western Enlightenment, after the Renaissance, as part of the Renaissance, and after into sort of 17th, 18th century forward. And that was the age of reason and rationalism. That's modern. So you become modern humans compared to pre-modern humans, compared to archaic humans. This is the idea, almost like subspecies, right? You can kind of hear we're all humans, but there's sort of very different ways of thinking, organizing, complicating, or simplifying depending on what direction. So not meant to be judgmental, one's better than the other, but there is sort of an idea in modern thought. So when modernity starts, the philosophies of modernism, and this would be something like Kant, Immanuel Kant, for example, and so on, many others, that this was the height, it was the peak of human development, so called. This modern era, you can hear it. Modern, you're modern. It was like an enlightened elite almost. But were they really enlightened is the question mark. And when I say question mark, the moment I questioned whether modernism and modern thought, modernity itself, historically and philosophically, whether it's as beautiful and bright and enlightened as it thinks it is. And postmodernists are the people, the thought, the new historical era that's emerging. Some people say it started with Nietzsche in the 19th century, but I would say, sorry, 20th century as well. But it could have basically been anything since the 60s, 1960s. Again, I'm talking mostly Western history here because that's just an easier picture, and it is the one that's most usually articulated and defined in encyclopedias, all the problems of that. But it's a fact. That's what we have to deal with and try to understand and critique. So postmodernity is the questioning of modernity is not so great. Modernism, right? The modern period said pre-modern's not so great, those people. Medieval times and classical times, sometimes called classical period. So historical periods. Now let's go to the next term, which is the underbelly. Underneath postmodernity as a historical form of way of knowing and knowledge, we could call it a methodology of reason and so on. Underneath that is a much more complicated and very tense, conflictual, and important methodological turn that was going on in human thinking. That again started in that 50s, 60s, 1950s, 60s, particularly starting in a lot of European history and thought and philosophy, the French intellectuals at that time, and a few others. You can again look up those terms if you really want to get more detail. I'm not going to give a lot of fine detail. I'm not a historian or a philosophical historian, but it's called post-structuralism because it means after structuralism. That's what post is, right? Postmodern after modern. And post-structuralism had the same skepticism about how great modernity was and how great in the underbelly this methodology called structuralism was. Structuralism arguing philosophically, as I'm generalizing horrifically here, but it's still worthy of acknowledging a generalization. It's about structure, that reality and life has this deeper structure and order. And that was underneath a lot of modern thinking, those philosophers, those thinkers, and became part of the popular discourse and the ways that people understood what it meant to be modern, what it meant to be a structuralist thinker. That's not a language we use so commonly, but it's certainly we use the modern thinker and modern person. That became popularized, but not the structuralist analysis. So, but it was, and it is. And to really understand postmodernism today, you have to understand post-structuralism and in a way look at why is post-structuralism evolved, why is the postmodern evolved, and you kind of can go back and start to understand and read about modernity and structuralism. Okay, those are some real guideposts for you in your study if you want to pursue this. But today's talk, hopefully there'll be enough that you'll get from it. I think there will be because I'm going to just cover some real basic ideas about postmodernity. And post-structuralism, I'm not going to talk so much about, other than post-structuralism is very much tied with postmodernity. They feed off of each other and participate off of each other. Most people, I'm making a generalization, when they say something about postmodernism, oh, postmodernism, maybe a critique, usually, that they don't like it because they are very modern. They like their modern thinking and ideas and believe, and some people are even pre-modern and they like those ideas better than modern. Those would be a lot of religious folks, traditional religions and philosophies. But when you go into postmodern, a lot of people critique it and think that very stereotypically And this is what they do. They tend to reduce it to really simple ideas, and they don't understand post-structuralism that's underneath postmodernity and the advantages of a post-structuralist approach to knowledge and reality and truth, all those ideas. And they critique postmodern period as negative, evil. I've heard all kinds of criticisms. You may have heard them too. And it's now being tabbed or tagged with this idea of wokeism. If you're wokeism, you're postmodernism. And those are an attachment that has been used politically against anything to do with postmodernity and post-structuralism without understanding what post-structuralism is. See what I'm saying? They really don't understand everything. And I listen to those people. They're just reacting to the cultural side, the popular and culture wars, it's sometimes called. That's culture wars is when postmodern ideas and values and post-structuralism are challenging the modern ideas and structuralism, order, hierarchies, and structure. Traditionalism, classicalism has a lot of those same tendencies of that kind of order and structure hierarchy. And post-structuralists have no order. They seem chaotic to these people. That's why they attack them as evil. They're trying to destroy tradition. They're trying to destroy the family. They have these really horrible relativistic, nihilistic, existentialistic. Those are all critiques that are thrown at postmodern. And then they'll even sometimes trace it, well, postmodern thinking, post-structuralist thinking underneath it, are tied to Friedrich Nietzsche, right? His 1800s declaration near the end of the 1800s of God is dead. He's basically saying, let's take away that structure, that order of a God-based structured hierarchy of a universe and reality, and let's open up our possibilities to see post that tradition, postmodern, post earlier times as well. Like that's the movement. And this is all about evolution. So it's about growth and development. It's what's coming next in the cycle of growth and development. So that's an argument that you can see I'm not making any judgment. I'm not saying it's good or bad necessarily. And the answer to that is postmodernity has good and bad. Hey, guess what? So did modernity. Good and bad. And good and bad in pre-modernity over our ancient architect, you know, ancient times. There's no one just all good. You don't get just all good in history. That would be one argument to make. So if you have that open-minded expansion that I just suggested is one way to look at evolution is the developmental cycle and things go a little bit forward, a little bit back. There's always a general improvement, maybe, or progress, we could say. And yet some people are saying, well, but look at how horrible the world is. You see, we need to get back to modern ideas because postmodern is just making it worse with relativism, nihilism, no order anymore. People do whatever they want, narcissistic, all these critiques. They think it's absolutely pathological to be a postmodern thinker and using post-structuralist thought. That's what they don't understand, of course, much about that. Some of their critiques are correct, and I have many of those same critiques. At times I've been, in going to university, I was like, this postmodern, like, get rid of this. This is like crappy stuff. Like, but a lot of it was very confusing and a lot of it very upsetting because I had to go through a cognitive dissonance in my learning. And that's what learning is. You have to go through some unlearning to learn new. And a lot of people don't want to do that. They're actually fearful, terrified to undo and let go of what they've already learned traditionally. You know that. We call it the fear of change. It's in the vocabulary of understanding and general common sense. Why that change? Because you have to let go of some of your pillars of how you understand yourself and the world and history and where the world's going and what's meaningful and what's useful to do and where it's going and where you should be going. And everybody has a bit of a different, through those historical eras, they have different ideas about that. And they're clashing. And postmodernity is really clashing against modernism because modernism is still pretty much the dominant form if you live certainly in the so-called first world of developed worlds. Its modernity is still the powerful central figuration of how to be modern. And then postmodern, as I say, has been creeping in since the 60s, 70s kind of revolutionary thinking. Now, another error I find in partly true is a lot of critics will come back at and challenge this postmodern world thinking, as well as post-structuralism, and saying it's pathological because it's thrown out God, which is not true. It's all Nietzsche, and worse, it's Marxism and communism. Those Marxists came out of the 60s in Europe, and that's what caused the French student rebellion, 68 and so on, right? And then it came into North America, that rebellion, youth rebellion, into the love generation, the peace generation of the hippies and the anti-war movements, and then feminism grew from that. And then the civil rights really grew even further and further. So those are all what we call postmodern movements that I just listed. They're about emancipation, about liberation. Now, the modern Enlightenment theorists, they believe their theory was about liberation from the pre-modern and the ancient views of traditional understanding and ways of knowing. So it's always going to be there. There's always going to be conflict in these transitional growth periods. That's one thing to keep in mind. So expect the conflict, but we have to discern, and that's why I'm talking today. Is I'm giving you maybe a few pillars, and I'm going to give you a couple more before I go. Pillars are ways to start taking apart and being critical of the critiques that are thrown around from postmodernists who also hate modernism, but I'm not thinking that's great either. You can be critical, but you don't have to hate it and attack it. And then, of course, people that then modernists want to attack or pre-modernists want to attack postmodernism as the evil that's destroying the world. And then they'll hook it to left wing Marxist, neo-Marxist, communism, socialism. That's got nothing to do with post-structuralist understanding of where post-structuralism is going and taking. And postmodernity is riding on post-structuralism. This idea that structures are much more organic, fluid, porous, evolving, emergent in a complex universe. And a lot of quantum theory, relativity theory, think of Einstein and so on, those are postmodern, post-structuralist ideas, to put it. They're kind of a style of postmodern breaking open old ideas of how we thought the universe worked in reality. Now, again, not saying they're the true or the totally absolute truth, but they're opening up, aren't they? They're giving us new possibilities for thinking, ways of being, and quantum physics and quantum ideas are part of that postmodern. Okay, so here's what I like is my best definition that I enjoyed from Ken Wilber's work, an integral philosopher who is postmodern and a post-structuralist in part. He's not totally adopted all of postmodernity or post-structuralist methodologies. He's adopted some of them, and he says they're pretty good. They're better than a lot of modernity ideas and modern structuralism. They capture more reality and they're more nuanced at capturing complexity. So complexity theory, chaos theory, they're also part of the postmodern, post-structuralism ideas and methodologies and theories. Ken Wilber says there's a lot of good there. I can see how that really advances our knowledge. It's going to take us in a good progressive direction, growth and development. But Ken Wilber says that's not the end. Post-structuralism and postmodernity are also have a growing edge, and we're seeing that evolve into what he calls, and some others, integral age. Not a postmodern age, but an integral age. And then even beyond that, he's got visions in his theorizing of worlds beyond integral, post-integral. So there's visionaries amongst us, and I'm just naming one who I have followed for over 40 years almost. And so what's now coming to be seen is that postmodernity has its upside and its downside. Well, let's give the upside. And the downside I've already kind of mentioned is a lot of the criticisms. It's relativity, everything goes, there's no center anymore, nobody knows what's good, right, wrong, right? That's where the modern and pre-moderns get really upset. They think they're losing good and bad, right and wrong. It's immoral, this kind of post-structuralist, postmodern. But Ken Wilber would come along and say, well, what's really at the core? What's the core of the corrective that postmodernity, postmodernism, is trying to bring to the insufficiencies of modernism and pre-modernism and the archaic? So take the best of each, he's saying, and then let's look at the best of what postmodernism offers. And he says it's three major things that are the movements, and you may have heard of some of these. Again, you may not, but take them in mind and you can look them up and do more research on them. Is first of all is constructivism. The thought and the practice, the theories and the philosophy of constructivism is about reality being constructed. There's no one reality already all there, but humans and other subjects are players and co-creating reality with their environment or the other. And that becomes what is called constructive reality. It's a constructed reality, which means it's not as permanent and absolute as the modernists and certainly the pre-modernists love their absolutes. Absolute God, absolute truth, absolute moral principle, law. So now we're saying laws are constructive and they can change, and they actually do historically. So they're not fixed. So we're now moving into a much more fluid and flowing part of understanding reality and how to do research, how to know, and how to teach, how to learn. More flowing, creative, as I say, where you participate as an agent in the constructing, not just taking what's already constructed and saying, oh, now I've got it and I memorized it, and so now I got this new truth. No, that's the old model of modern, and that's really the model of pre-modern. So the other one is contextualization, contextualism. Contextualism asks us that any knowledge piece is only as good as what you can understand about the context in which that knowledge was created, that truth, that reality, that knowledge piece, that values piece, that moral code, that law, whatever it may be, that relationship. It's always contextual. And if you shift the context of the same thing, put it in another context, so that's like me being in North America, put me in the context of living in China, I'm in another context, I actually become different. I am not the same. I'm going to be going through all kinds of different things, and I'm actually going to be changing physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually in some way. Not totally. And that's called contextualist understanding and thinking. It's really important, just like constructivism, to get to a more complex post-structural understanding of reality. Then we've got the last one, which is a little more complicated. I won't be able to go fully into it. I'll give you a few ideas about it. Is called integral or aperspectival thinking. Aperspectival thinking has emerged in this post-structuralist, postmodern era because it's a leading edge taking us to the integral age. It's preparing us to be able to adapt and use integral thought, aperspectival thought. Aperspectival means something like generalizing, be able to take many perspectives. That's also part of postmodern. Take many perspectives before you just decide one perspective. Take many perspectives and look at the best that each has to offer, but don't settle on any one perspective unless you do strategically for a particular time, but knowing there's always another perspective that would add to the reality or full holistic understanding of where you're going and what you want to do, when you want to analyze, what you want to intervene on, try to make solutions to problem solving. Be aperspectival. That means not attached. Not attached to perspectives, but still using many. So that becomes a very powerful form of knowledge making and way of being as you start to understand you can be a perspectival person. And what would that mean? Well, it would mean that you're really good at mediating conflicts because you can listen to many perspectives and put yourself in many different positions. And you don't have to attach to that one and or yourself attached to that one. You really can get into what I'd call a deep empathy and a deep compassion. Ken Wilber talks about that. And you get into that more and more richly as you start to understand the self, yourself, starts to become more porous, more liquidy, more constructed, more contextual, more aperspectival. That's what postmodernity is trying to correct from modernism that got stuck in oneself, more or less, and one perspective, and everybody should match that, and then they're okay, and they're as good as you. But if they're not, they're dumber than you, right? Or they're stupider, or they're more primitive, or they're whatever. So that's where modernity has its pathology of getting really stuck in a mono perspective. Same in traditionalism. That is an old, you know, inheritance from pre-modern absolute kinds of thinking as well, when you got attached to mono perspectives, mono gods, and so on. Theism. So this is poly, it's multiple, but integral still says be critical of. It doesn't mean just accept everything either. You have to also make discernments and judgments. And that's a much more complex topic. I'm going to put this now into spiral dynamics theory. Spiral dynamics theory, like Ken Wilber, and Ken Wilber has influenced and been influenced by spiral dynamics theory of Don Beck, going back to Clare Graves' psychology of human levels of development, of evolution, and what he called memes. And V memes, or these world views, virtually world spaces, sometimes they're called, are like these different eras, or almost like a different subspecies of human who attach to these memes that carried on, like genes, influences, memes of values and ways of being and methodologies of knowing also. Sometimes they're called discourses. They have influenced us also. And so we just jump into them and we adopt that meme and we operate within it. And so there's color coding to those memes in spiral dynamics theory. You can look it up. I won't be going into the full theory. It's pretty interesting. I studied it and have a certificate in level 2 of analysis of spiral dynamics. That's a technology. But the point being is postmodern is what's called green value meme. And it's all about equalitarian as well. So all these perspectives are equal and important. We should look at them all. So that's postmodern. That's post-structuralist. Right? There's no one structure to know reality from that's absolute. So pay attention to all or many and give them equal value in the circle at the table. And so that equalitarian is a great quality. Now, one of the good qualities, but also the downside, is that you can get to a point where you can't make up your mind and you can't discern anymore because you're so interested in just getting more perspectives. But then you can't actually make judgments about those perspectives and discernments to take action. So that leads to what sometimes is called a postmodern craziness or a post-structuralist nightmare of people who, and it happens, and it can happen to you. That's, I think, a lot of people who are critics of postmodernity modernity and post-structuralism are critical that you lose your anchors and your reference points. Well, and I'm saying, well, good postmodern thinking, but if you look at contextualism, constructivism, and aperspectivalism, you don't give up what was good in modernity and pre-modernity and ancient times. You integrate it. So that's a really important word, integrated, and that becomes integral. And that's the stage after this green postmodern and a lot of extreme green postmodern, which I find very pathological, as does Ken Wilber and many other critics. And so there's good reasons to criticize postmodernity, postmodernism, when it becomes an ideology of you have to think like me. In other words, you have to think green and equal values and multiplicities. And if you don't, then you're bad, you're wrong, you're like those people, the hierarchies and so on. And they get that's where wokeism kind of gets its worst when it gets into extreme postmodern, extreme post-structuralist, but not a very advanced postmodern, not a very mature post-structuralism. And it's mostly because people don't understand the post-structuralist dimension of postmodernism. They don't understand that definition I just gave you by Ken Wilber of those three main contributions of moving ahead, really advancing in good ways in thinking, thought, and our value system. So this green value system has a really other kind of an ugly dimension, and it becomes victim-centered. And that's when it is so sensitive, this green modern meme. And I'm glad it is sensitive because we're in sensitive times. And we can't just be cold and rational like modernists would like us to be. It's not enough. Human and life systems require the sensitivity as well. So we're trying to bring that back. And a lot of pre-modern people really have that sensitivity, and they have that feeling and felt and emotional capability, which modernity threw a lot of that out the water. They wanted logic, rationalism, reason. That was the truth, the best truth. So we're trying green this postmodern time. Post-structuralist thought is very much feeling, embodied, very body-based, somatic, getting back to emotional intelligence. These kinds of ideas are coming from this new movement into postmodern. But they get to the point of extreme when they're not thought of from an integral perspective as well, not just postmodern, but an integral view of postmodern. That's what I'm talking about today. That's what Ken Wilber's talking about. That's spiral dynamic. It takes an integral perspective on postmodern and says, yeah, you're great, show up. Give us a sensitivity to being victimized and the oppressed and so on. That's good. But don't get attached to it too deeply as the only understanding. And that's what wokeism in its worst has done. It's got attached to trying to impose the experience and reality of victims, the lowest in a sense on the chain, right, of oppression, and trying to bring them up to be the ones who lead and bring their views up to dominate and remove the other views and approaches because they're right. They're right because they're victims. And a lot of people are trying to rescue the victims in postmodernity. Rescue, protect, secure. There's a lot of savioring. They will be their savior. And these people get very radical and very narrow-minded when they ought to be in the true postmodern condition, the true best of post-structuralism. They ought not to be getting attached. And so they're postmodernists, but not good postmodernists. You see what I'm saying? They have a lot of partiality, and it's just probably a lot of it they just never learned properly. So we have to educate ourselves on these eras and the methodological underbellies of these historical eras. That's my point today. I've given you some ideas. So in a way, I'm now focusing on becoming a postmodern apologetics philosopher. I think I've been really critical of postmodern and been quite integral in a lot of my work, but coming back more and more is there's a lot in postmodernism, post-structuralism that a lot of people are just not well educated on. And so I'm becoming an apologetic for postmodernism in its worst. Okay, yes, it has its worst, horrific in many ways, but modernism has horrific as well, and pre-modern. And those are still working in the world because not all the world is, modern and postmodern. No, most of the world is not. But the really powerful players who are going to probably destroy the world if we don't get this figured out better and understood and educated better in the postmodern condition and this post-structuralist advantage to knowledge, thinking, and being, and projecting into the world in a good way. It doesn't just protect victims. That's the healthy side of postmodernity. The unhealthy side, it puts victims up to the top and wants to give them a medal. I could give you lots of examples of all of that victimization, hyper victimization, hypersensitivity to victims and hurting. And then people become locked in emotionalism, ultimately, even though they can have very sophisticated ideas supporting their cause, their movement, their righteousness. And a lot of it is very good that they're righteous about certain victimizations. Those shouldn't be going on, but we're not over it. And I'm just saying the green meme answer, that value structure of sensitivity to the wounded and the victim, it's got a lot of pathologies and messes in it, and it's not helping that much either. In fact, it's making a lot of things worse. Fascism, which is growing now, we see it in the United States just recently, since the last year, the election. It's a form of pre-modernism, and it's going back to really ancient pre-modern ideas because it can't stand postmodern. It hates it, and it likes a lot of modernism, but it doesn't like all of modernism. And it really likes some of the ideological, vicious absolutism of pre-modern. And again, there's good stuff in pre-modern too. So tradition, and yet it's in a very twisted personalities of these fascist leaders, the authoritarianism. See, authoritarianism always tells you, oh, that's pre-modern. See, that was the whole thing about modernity, that we try and get rid of the kings, try and get rid of the authoritarian, totalitarian, fascist leaders who, you know, can't think in modern ways. They want to protect their traditional uh, ways, and a lot is religion, but it's not just religion. You can have, ideologies that are secular as well as sacred. So I think that's kind of what I wanted to cover today. If you have any comments or questions, I'll continue talking on my postmodern apologetics, as they call it in academia. But in other words, I apologize for a lot of the worst of postmodernism and post-structuralism, and I want to reclaim and help educate that there's a lot of good and really important bases for positive and transformative change within postmodernism and post-structuralism.